Number 12. Anomalocaris. Rock dust hangs in the air as a preparator's needle taps the slab, grain by grain. First, a spined arm emerges, then a ring of teeth, then the impossible realization these were never separate creatures at all. For nearly a century, the sea had been giving up this predator like a shredded confession. One fossil called a shrimp tail, another filed away as a jellyfish, the rest scattered through museum drawers under the wrong names. When the pieces finally lock together, a new silhouette glides out of the Cambrian dark. Nearly a meter long, built for speed, with grasping appendages and eyes made to hunt in open water. This is Anomalocaris, one of the first great ocean predators we can recognize. Its body reaches us in fragments, misread and displaced. The deep keeps returning evidence in broken pieces. Number 12. The shrimp that swallowed its own body. You are in Ottawa in the early 1980s, bent over a Burgess Shale slab under hard white light.
The room is quiet, except for the tap of metal on stone. Harry Whittington leans in, steady as a watchmaker, and peels away another paper-thin layer. A curved spine appears first, then another. The shape is wrong for anything filed in the drawer. Too deliberate, too armed. He keeps going. The slab begins to answer. A segmented appendage pushes out of the rock, joint after joint, 14 podomeres laid in a line like a folding trap. Each one carries inward-pointing spines. It looks less like a leg than a rake built to close. Just beneath it, another form begins to emerge. A circular structure, plates arranged in a ring. Not a shell, not a jellyfish bell. A mouth. A mouth sitting where no one had expected one to be. Down the hall, the old labels in the cabinets are already failing. In 1892, Joseph Frederick Whitehaves held a fossil just 76 millimeters long from the Mount Stephen trilobite beds in British Columbia and described it as the tail of a strange shrimp. He named it Anomalocaris canadensis. Strange shrimp. Odd shrimp. The name stuck because names do that. The joke in the name was brutal. The shrimp had no head because it was not a shrimp at all. Picture the drawers opening one by one. In one, Whitehaves' shrimp tail, which is not a tail. In another, the circular mouth, catalogued as something separate, something soft and drifting, almost jellyfish-like. In another, body flaps and trunk sections treated as yet another animal entirely. A predator nearly 1 meter long had been split into separate identities so completely that for decades no one could see the animal. Everyone was staring at its pieces. Whittington lifts the needle again. Stone powders away. The appendage and the mouth remain connected. In that instant, the fossil stops looking like debris. You can almost see the animal alive above the Cambrian seafloor more than 500 million years ago. Its body flexes. Lateral flaps beat in sequence down both sides like rows of living fins. It does not crawl. It does not wait. It glides. Fast enough to cross open water. Stable enough to turn. Big enough to change what smaller things do when its shadow passes over them. Then the head turns. The eyes are not guesses anymore. From other Cambrian deposits, eyes assigned to Anomalocaris measure 2 to 3 centimeters across and carry more than 16,000 lenses each. 16,000. An animal this old, in an ocean this early. Vision sharp enough to pick movement out of suspended light, to separate drifting debris from flesh, to spot soft bodies where the water darkens and the bottom falls away. This is not a blunt scavenger blundering through mud. It is a visual hunter. The appendages reach forward first, paired, spined, flexible. They open slightly as the animal closes distance, the way hands open before the grab. Something smaller hangs in the water column ahead, soft-bodied, exposed, beating weakly through the current. The appendages snap inward, not crushing, seizing, drawing prey toward that circular mouth while the body keeps moving. For years, the old cartoon version of this animal showed it smashing trilobites like a Cambrian nutcracker. At a glance, it worked. The mouth looked severe, the size was there, the attitude was there. But as the anatomy comes into focus, that scene falls apart. Those frontal appendages are not fit clubs built to shatter armor. Modern biomechanical work points the other way. Speed, reach, grip. A hunter for soft prey in open water, not a shell crusher battering the seafloor. Now the scene changes. The trilobites below are not exploding under its bite. They are beneath it, armored and awkward and perhaps safer than they once seemed. The real strike happens off the bottom, in the dim, suspended world above them. A meter-long body approaches through the haze.
A pair of spined arms closes before anything slow has time to fold, burrow, or sink. Whittington clears a little more rock. The body line lengthens. The monster assembles itself not from fantasy, but from clerical error. Drawer by drawer, misfile by misfile.
Charles Walcott uncovered the Burgess Shale in 1909, and from that moment, the mountain kept surrendering impossible anatomy into human hands. But the surrender was incomplete. That made it deceptive. A mouth without a body is one animal. A claw without a head is another. A set of flaps without either becomes a third. The sea was telling the truth, just never in order. By 1985, Whittington and Derek Briggs published the reconstruction that finally snapped the fragments into one living outline. The largest known Cambrian animal from the Burgess Shale, a predator assembled out of mistakes. Not many feet long by later standards, about 3 feet at most. But in its own world, at its own moment, enormous enough to matter. And on the slab in front of you, the proof is still half buried. One appendage, one mouth, one body coming back together under a needlepoint while a century of confident labels quietly dies. Anomalocaris was named from the wrong part.
Number 11. Pterigotus. In 1839, Louis Agassiz opened a massive geology volume on the Silurian system and placed a new fossil inside it under the heading of fish. The name he gave it was Pterigotus, the winged one. The word came out of a problem. Scottish quarrymen in the old red sandstone of Forfarshire had been hauling up broad, patterned plates since around 1834. The things did not look like a clean skull or a spine or any other respectable piece of vertebrate anatomy. They looked broken, flattened, symmetrical in ways that made no immediate sense, almost like wings. Agassiz saw the specimens in Edinburgh, and even he, the great classifier of fossil fishes, could only force them into a fish-shaped idea. This animal entered science as a filing decision in a book, not as a monster and not as a skeleton. The fragments were so alien that one of the sharpest eyes in 19th century paleontology put the predator in the wrong kingdom. Agassiz was not careless. He was working with what the stone allowed. The old red sandstone preserves bodies as impressions and plates, often scattered and compressed, the original three-dimensional animal ironed flat into a set of clues. One broad segment resembles armor, another looks like a fin base. The mind reaches for fish, so Agassiz did. In 1839, he treated Pterigotus cautiously as a giant fossil fish, because the alternative was stranger. These wings belonged to an arthropod large enough to make the familiar modern world feel too small. The rock kept talking. By 1844, better Scottish material forced Agassiz to reverse himself. Pterigotus was not a fish at all. It was a huge eurypterid, a sea scorpion.
The broad pieces were not fins. They were parts of an armored body built low and wide, with a swimming paddle behind and, at the front, chelicerae, toothed appendages near the mouth, robust enough not merely to slice, but to crush. That sounds technical until you picture the scene it changes. A fish belongs in one Devonian story. A sea scorpion belongs in another. The first is a swimmer among swimmers. The second is an ambush machine built on a much older plan. A hard-shelled predator moving through shallow water systems between about 443 and 359 million years ago, across the Silurian and Devonian, while early vertebrates were getting faster, better armed, and much harder to catch. Picture Agassiz with the new material in front of him. The wing is no wing. The fish is no fish. The quarrymen of Forfarshire had not been pulling up the remains of some odd, armored vertebrate. They had been splitting open the body of an arthropod that in some species approached 1.75 meters long, nearly 6 feet, with compound eyes tuned for hunting and mouthparts built for force. In 2015, researchers argued that Pterigotus anglicus had vision comparable to modern predatory arthropods. The fragments sharpen at once. Those patterned plates stop looking decorative. They become the casing of an animal that could see you, track you, and bring crushing chelicerae in close. Even then, one problem remained. Agassiz could rename the animal. He could move it from fish to sea scorpion. He could give science a cleaner identity for Pterigotus. He still could not show it alive. The story jumps more than a century and a half, from 19th century Scotland to northern New Brunswick in the 1990s. Randall Miller and Jeff McGovern were working the lower Devonian Campbellton Formation when they found something Agassiz had wanted all along, relatively complete Pterigotus. Not a single suggestive plate, not a lonely wing, more of the animal at once. enough to stop guessing from isolated pieces and start reading a body. At the outcrop, the scale is immediately different from the fossils people imagine when they hear sea scorpion. This is not a tiny curiosity in a tray. The body sections are broad, the paddles make hydrodynamic sense. The head region carries the hardware that made the genus dangerous in the first place. The species matters too. These New Brunswick fossils were identified as Pterygotus anglicus, the same species Agassiz had recognized from Scotland in 1844.
The animal that entered science as a mistake was now returning in a second country, in better condition, with enough anatomy to restore not just its form, but its role. Then the outcrop delivered the detail that changed the rhythm of the whole story. The Pterygotus fossils were found only meters from Doliotis problematicus, an early shark, a toothed mouth, another predator in the same Lower Devonian system. The old sea scorpion is no longer standing alone as a museum monster. It has company, competition, maybe even a killer. Now the numbers start to feel forensic. Pterygotus anglicus had the eyes of a visual hunter and the robust, crushing chelicerae of an animal built to subdue hard-fighting prey. Doliotis had jaws and teeth, part of the early shark experiment that would eventually rewrite ocean predation altogether. Found only meters apart, they turn a fossil site into a standoff. One lineage armored, jointed, ancient. The other cartilaginous, toothed, and arriving with a body plan that would dominate later seas. The ecosystem tightens around them. The rock never says who won. Maybe Pterygotus was the dominant hunter in those waters, patrolling shallow channels and attacking early fish before they could accelerate clear. Its compound eyes support that reading. Its mouthparts support it too. This was not simply a giant scorpion dragged into the sea by popular imagination. It was a purpose-built aquatic arthropod. But Doliotis problematicus was there as well, and a shark-shaped future was already taking form. The New Brunswick slabs do something deceptively cruel. They bring the two predators almost together, only meters apart, close enough to imply violence, close enough to suggest hierarchy, and still they refuse to say which one hunted which. That pattern runs from Agassiz to the present. He started with broken pieces and named a phantom fish. Better fossils corrected the outline, but not the whole life. More complete specimens arrived in the 1990s and gave the animal back its eyes, its paddles, and its crushing face. They also placed Pterygotus beside an early shark and opened a new uncertainty exactly where an old one closed. The evidence improved. The picture got stranger. The winged one was never a wing, never a fish, maybe not even the unquestioned ruler it once seemed. An arthropod predator reconstructed from error, then pushed back into doubt by the company it kept. The oldest line in its history still lands the hardest. Agassiz's own name, printed in 1839. Pterygotus. Number 10. Camaraoceras. In 1842, Timothy Abbott Conrad was working through fossils from the Trenton limestone of New York when he named a giant straight-shelled cephalopod Camaraoceras trentonense. The locality was Middleville. The rock was Ordovician. The fossils were not cinematic skeletons laid out nose to tail. They were sections, broken chambers, stony cones cut off at both ends. From those pieces, Conrad saw enough to name something large, predatory, and very old. 5 years later, in 1847, James Hall described related giant endocerids under another name, Endoceras. Trouble begins there. Two giant straight-shelled cephalopod names enter the same fossil beds, and most of what survives is incomplete. The clean monster of popular imagination starts to dissolve. The myth version is simple. Camaraoceras becomes a 6-meter, 8-meter, sometimes 9-meter torpedo with arms on the front, cruising Ordovician seas like an oversized squid in a shell. It shows up in books, lists, museum captions, and online art as one of the first truly gigantic marine predators. Long cone, huge body, apex hunter. Case closed. Start with the evidence, and the case opens again. What is actually common in the rock? Not whole shells, fragments, often less than 25 centimeters long. A hand-sized piece of cone, a section of chamber wall, part of the internal plumbing. Enough to say, giant endocerid was here, but not enough to stretch confidently into a full animal every time. Complete specimens are rare. That matters. Every extra meter in a reconstruction has to be earned, not imagined. Now the shell itself. Better documented Ohio material gives a conch diameter above 20 centimeters and a length around 200 to 210 centimeters.
That is still enormous for an Ordovician cephalopod. You are looking at a straight living cone roughly the length of a tall human, armored in mineral, moving through a shallow tropical sea 450 million years ago. It is not the same thing as the giant internet version. 2 meters is a predator. 9 meters is a legend. The rock supports the first far better than the second. If the shell was not a record-breaking spear every time, what made it dangerous? Not teeth, not speed, plumbing. Inside the shell ran a siphuncle so large it could reach 10 centimeters across, sometimes up to half the shell's diameter, usually pressed near the ventral wall. This was the control system. A giant buoyancy organ threaded through chamber after chamber, working with nested deposits called endocones. Camaraoceras was less like a missile and more like a pressure-managed hunting platform. Heavy shell, soft body at the open end. Eyes, arms, and beak facing forward. Weight controlled from within. The picture changes fast. Popular art loves pursuit. A better ecological label is nectobenthic carnivore. Not a blue water chaser, not a shark analog. An animal that likely cruised close to the seafloor, suspended but low, hunting where hard-shelled prey actually lived. Trilobites. Smaller cephalopods. Other shelled animals moving over or just above the bottom. You do not need a sprinting super predator for that. You need reach, stability, a beak at the end of a long, controlled cone. Picture the Ordovician Interior Sea covering parts of what are now New York, Ohio, Kentucky, and Ontario. Warm, shallow, full of carbonate mud. The bottom is busy with shelled life. Put yourself a few feet above that floor. Light filters down through green water. Ahead of you is not a fish shape. It is a pale, narrowing cylinder drifting level, longer than your body, open at one end where the real animal waits. It does not have to rush. In water like that, ambush can be slow. Even that image comes with a forensic warning. After death, an endocerid shell becomes its own liar. Once the soft parts are gone, the empty conch can break apart, settle, or drift before burial. In deeper deposits, post-mortem drifting is considered probable, and an allochthonous origin cannot be excluded. In plain terms, the fossil may not have died where you found it. The sea can move the evidence. It can snap a giant shell into transportable lengths, carry them, drop them into limestone or shale, and let a later collector mistake a redistributed corpse for a local monster. That matters for size. It matters for habitat. It matters for every dramatic map that paints Camaraoceras exactly where a broken piece turned up. So the detective story is not, was there a predator? There absolutely was. The real problem is which predator, how large, and under which name. The historical knot is old and stubborn. Conrad's Camaraoceras appears in 1842. Hall's Endoceras follows in 1847. Later workers sort giant straight shells by characters that do not always behave cleanly in fragmentary fossils. Shell texture here, internal structure there. Different portions of large endocerids separated into different bins. Some of the famous giant material assigned in popular culture to Camaraoceras may partly belong inside Endoceras, or inside a broader tangle of endocerid identification that was never as neat as the illustrations made it look. The Atlas of Ordovician Life says the confusion directly. Once the specialists admit the labels blur, every sensational length claim starts to wobble. This is where the myth usually tries one last move. Fine, maybe the name is messy, maybe the shell is fragmentary. Surely the animal was still the undisputed titan of its world. Maybe. But the evidence does not reward surely. What it gives you is narrower and better. A giant straight-shelled cephalopod from the Middle to Late Ordovician, possibly extending questionably into the Middle Silurian in some listings. A nectobenthic carnivore, a shell around 2 meters in strong documented material with a diameter beyond 20 centimeters.
A siphuncle so oversized, it becomes the main clue to how the animal lived, and a fossil record dominated not by complete monsters, but by pieces. Always pieces. What the water returns is broken, and the breaks are exactly where the exaggerations get in. Go back to Conrad at Middleville. A name is printed, then Hall prints another. Decades pass. Museum drawers fill with cones, chamber walls, siphuncles, and fragments under old labels. Artists extend missing ends. Popular media extends them further. Somewhere inside that pile is a real Ordovician predator moving low over the seafloor, deadly enough without becoming absurd. You try to pin it down by size, by range, even by name. The specimen in your hand keeps shrinking to a broken section of shell. That is the scene left on the table. Not a complete sea monster, not even a complete corpse, just a 25-centimeter fragment on a tray, a genus name from 1842, another from 1847, and the possibility that the giant everyone thinks they recognize stands in the literature under the wrong label.
Number 9. Helicoprion. In 1950, in phosphate country near Montpelier, Idaho, a fossil collector pulled a coil of teeth from Permian rock and handed science another problem. The specimen later entered the Idaho Museum of Natural History as IMNH 37899, Idaho 4. Look at the shape first. Not a jaw, not a skull, a spiral. Teeth packed against teeth, curling inward like a watch spring made of enamel. For decades, that geometry drove the entire argument, because most of the animal was gone. That absence mattered. Helicoprion lived around 270 million years ago, but like sharks and their relatives, it built its skeleton from cartilage. Cartilage does not preserve like bone. The deep gave back the hardest part and kept the frame. Collectors kept finding whorls. By 2013, at least 100 public specimens were known, and more than half came from Idaho's Rocky Mountain foothills. By 2023, the Idaho Museum alone held more than 90 specimens. You might expect numbers like that to settle the case.
They did the opposite. The evidence kept arriving in quantity, but in the wrong form. Broken pieces, repeated. The mechanism itself was the problem. A normal shark replaces teeth in rows. Old teeth fall out, new teeth move forward. Helicoprion worked differently. Its teeth were anchored on a continuous spiral root. More than 130 teeth could ride on that growing coil. Newer teeth formed farther back. Older teeth were not shed into the water. They were carried forward and inward along the spiral, tighter and tighter, so the mouth kept its own history inside itself. The fossil looks less like a dental arcade than a machine part, but no one knew what machine it belonged to.
Alexander Karpinski named Helicoprion in 1899. Scientists and artists kept filling in the missing anatomy with guesswork. Some put the whorl on the snout, like a circular saw bolted to the face. Some pushed it into the throat. Some treated it almost like an external weapon. Official drawings changed. Museum labels changed. Species concepts changed. The fossil did not. Same spiral, same missing body, same problem. 3 revised species concepts eventually dominated the discussion: Helicoprion davicii, H. besonoi, and H. ergasamenon. But classification was not the embarrassment. Placement was. Paleontology had a predator with a famous tooth structure and no agreed location for the teeth. Then came February 27, 2013. Leif Tapanila and colleagues put the Idaho specimen through CT scans. Not a sketch, not a guess from the surface. Slice after slice through stone. For the first time, the numbers matched anatomy. The whorl sat in the midline of the lower jaw.
It was not hanging off the snout. It was not lodged deep in the throat. It sat in the lower jaw, close to the jaw joint, wrapped by the jaws themselves. When the mouth closed, the spiral did not spin like a movie prop blade. It rolled backward relative to the closing motion, drawing prey inward across the tooth edges. The famous buzz saw was not a rotating saw. It was a growth and cutting system. Conveyor belt is closer than chainsaw. That correction redraws the animal. If the lower jaw carried the whorl near the rear, then the feeding stroke was not about stabbing. It was about slicing soft prey along a single, tightening arc of teeth. The newest and largest teeth sat where they could do the work. Oldest stayed trapped deeper in the curl. A normal predator discards old weapons. Helicoprion kept adding to them. Now put it back in the rock. Southeastern Idaho and adjacent Wyoming preserve one of the key settings for this animal in the Phosphoria Formation. In the Meade Peak Phosphatic Shale member, the age range runs from 273.2 to 268.6 million years. That places these fossils deep in the Permian, long before modern sharks took over the image of open water predation. And phosphate country is literal here. These were industrial sediments mined for fertilizer. One of the strangest predators in marine history did not come out of a dramatic cliff face expedition. It came up in rock people were digging for phosphorus. The dimensions play the same game. Idaho Museum staff planned a modest, full-bodied reconstruction at 13 feet. Larger specimens were estimated up to 25 feet. That range tells you exactly where certainty stops. The tooth whorls are real.
The jaws around one specimen are much clearer now. The full body still has to be inferred by comparison with related cartilaginous fishes. Helicoprion was not a true shark. The 2013 work placed it closer to holocephalans, the lineage that includes ratfish. For a century, the public filed it away as a bizarre shark with a spinning death wheel. The evidence points somewhere stranger. A distant, shark-like relative with a lower jaw spiral that no living fish has repeated. The archive added one more twist in 2023. The holotype of Helicoprion ergasiminon, collected at the Gay Mine east of Fort Hall, Idaho, was identified in Copenhagen and returned after more than 60 years away. More than 6 decades. The defining specimens of one of the most famous fossil fish in America had effectively been misplaced overseas, while the animal itself remained anatomically unresolved at home. Even the paperwork around Helicoprion broke apart like the fossil record. Strip away the myth and the mechanics stay. A Permian cartilaginous fish, roughly 270 million years old. A lower jaw built around one continuous tooth spiral carrying more than 130 teeth. New growth added at the back. Older teeth moved inward. The bite closed by pulling prey across the whorl, not by spinning it under a free blade. Probably a hunter of softer-bodied prey, because that system cuts better than it crushes. Every part of that picture comes from structure. None of it needs the monster version. Helicoprion is often treated as the solved case now, the famous spiral-toothed shark, whose mystery ended in 2013. What snapped into focus was the mouth. The rest is still reconstruction draped over a dental mechanism. A 13-foot model that might have been 25. A predator known from dozens upon dozens of specimens that still refused to yield a complete skeleton. The deep did return an answer. It returned a lower jaw and a spiral, and left the body behind. Number 8. Xiphactinus. In June 1952, in the Smoky Hill Chalk of Gove County, Kansas, George F. Sternberg and his crew were cutting a giant fish out of white rock. Then the body opened into a second skeleton. Not fragments, not stomach residue, a whole fish still lying inside the hunter that had swallowed it. The outer animal was catalogued as FHSMVP-333. The fish inside became FHSMVP-334. One predator, one victim. Both locked together for roughly 80 million years. The scene points to something brutally simple in the late Cretaceous Sea over Kansas. Xiphactinus hit large prey at speed, swallowed it whole, and sometimes paid for that choice almost at once. This was not some bottom-feeding oddity from a forgotten corner. Xiphactinus audax, named by Joseph Leidy in 1870, later nicknamed the X-fish, was one of the big open-water predators of the western interior seaway. Long, bony, fast. Its shape was closer to a giant tarpon crossed with a tuna than to the lumbering monster fish people tend to imagine. Crescent tail. Deep fork. Large conical teeth built for seizing, not slicing. Wide gape. Mobile jaws. In late Cretaceous seas, carnivorous teleosts like this were among the most numerous predators in the water column. The middle of this ocean was not empty space between the famous monsters. It was crowded. It was lethal. And one of the animals that owned that space was a fish just over 13 feet long. Inside it lay a Gillicus arcuatus, about 6 feet long. 2 meters of prey, almost intact. The fossil gives almost everything except motion. Open water. A fast approach from below or behind. A lunge. A grip with conical teeth that pin rather than carve. Then the gulp. Xiphactinus did not need to dismember prey if its jaws could engulf it. It could force the animal down headfirst or sideways and let body mass do the rest. But a 6-foot fish is not a mouthful, it is a commitment. Once swallowed, it keeps its spines, its fins, its weight, and whatever panic is left in it. Sternberg's specimen feels less like a trophy than a forensic file. The Gillicus inside was still largely intact, so the predator almost certainly died soon after feeding. There was no long stretch of digestion, no leisurely final meal. A kill, a swallow, and then something went wrong fast enough to leave the evidence in place. Maybe the prey fought after it was inside. Maybe fin rays tore tissue. Maybe the sheer bulk of a 6-foot fish jammed the gut, crushed organs, or destabilized a body already under stress. The exact cause remains unresolved. The fossil still fixes the outcome. It shows the consequence 80 million years later, with the victim still inside the attacker like a confession the chalk never let decay. Zephactinus was built for the kind of speed that makes bad decisions catastrophic. A 2020 study argued that Zephactinus audax shows evidence consistent with endothermy. Not mammal-like in every sense, but warm-bodied enough to support a giant, active, macro-predatory lifestyle. In plain terms, this was likely not a sluggish ambush fish drifting through warm shallows. It was an engine, high-performance muscle in an inland sea, the kind of predator that could cover water quickly, hit hard, and keep hunting in ways a colder, slower fish could not. That old picture of Cretaceous oceans as reptile territory with fish in the background starts to crack here.
Zephactinus was this active, this common, and this heavily armed with speed and gape that it was operating in serious company. Its known range stretches widely across North America, from Alabama to Texas to Montana, in units like the Niobrara Formation, Greenhorn Limestone, Carlisle Shale, and Pierre Shale. It persisted from the Aptian to the Maastrichtian by some listings, an enormous span of Cretaceous time. This was not a local fluke, it was a durable design. That design may have reached even higher up the food chain than the famous fish within a fish fossil suggests. In 2026, researchers described a probable Zephactinus tooth embedded in the neck vertebra of a subadult Polycotylus plesiosaur from Greene County, Alabama. One tooth. One bone. A hard little impact. If the identification holds, then a giant bony fish bit a marine reptile in the throat. Not scavenging scales from the margins, not staying politely in its lane, going for the neck. Put the pieces together. A warm-bodied pursuit predator. A body optimized for open water. A gape wide enough to swallow prey half its own length. Evidence of attacks that may have reached into marine reptile territory. And in Kansas, the clearest scene of all, a hunter that took one oversized prize and died with the proof still inside it. Zephactinus may have fed at the edge of its own mechanical limit, in an inland sea crowded with sharks, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and other fast teleosts. Hesitation costs meals. So the animal keeps choosing size, speed, shock, whole prey. Every so often, the arithmetic fails inside its own body. That makes Sternberg's 1952 specimen more than a famous fossil. A snapshot of appetite outrunning safety, a mistake the chalk was able to keep. The water returned two animals at once, but only because one of them never finished swallowing the other. In life, Zephactinus would have vanished into blue water the moment after the strike, all motion and silver muscle. In death, it sank with a second fish sealed inside its ribs, carrying its last decision downward through a dark sea. The flesh went first, then the water, then even the ocean itself. The scene stayed. Number 7. Dunkleosteus. In 1867, J. Terrell was walking the Lake Erie cliffs near Sheffield Lake, west of Cleveland, when he found armor in the shale. Not loose scales, not stone shaped like driftwood, heavy plates from a fish built like a weapon. The rock belonged to the Cleveland Shale, mud laid down about 360 million years ago, when northern Ohio sat beneath a dark basin sea. Large animals died there and sank headfirst into low-oxygen sediment. The mud preserved the parts hardest to destroy. When Terrell pulled those pieces from the cliff, he was holding a record from a vanished seafloor. But the record was incomplete from the start. The animal later passed through older names, then in 1956 formally became Dunkleosteus terrelli. Dunkel for Cleveland Museum paleontologist David Dunkel, Terrelli for the man who first found it. By then, museums already knew the kind of animal they had. A placoderm, an armored fish. A predator whose mouth carried no ordinary teeth, but sharpened bony jaw plates that slid past each other like shears. Start with the bite. More than 4,400 newtons at the jaw tip, and more than 5,300 at the rear plates in the classic 2007 model. Set that beside a great white's famous bite, and the comparison shifts fast. This animal did not need fangs. It had edges built to crush and slice.
The most important exhibit in the file is not a skull. It is a silhouette. For decades, that silhouette kept getting longer. 6 meters, 8, 10. Public displays stretched Dunkleosteus into a torpedo with a tank for a head. A super predator crossing the Devonian seas like a prehistoric great white in plate armor. The image worked because the front half was real. The head and thoracic shield fossilized again and again in the Cleveland Shale. Broad skull roof, jointed neck armor, jaw plates honed into blades. Behind that, the evidence almost vanished. The rear half was cartilaginous and usually decayed before it could turn to stone. One of the most famous predators of the Devonian became famous for the part nobody had actually seen. You can see the problem on a museum label. The Cleveland Museum still acknowledges a historical public range from about 9.8 feet to 33 feet, roughly 3 to 10 meters, because no complete body has ever been found. Same animal, same fossil record. More than 20 feet of difference depending on how you imagine the missing half. That is the gap between a huge fish and a legend. Then in 2023, paleontologist Russell Engelman went back to the file and treated the silhouette itself as suspect. Instead of assuming Dunkleosteus scaled like a shark, he compared arthrodires as arthrodires and asked a blunt question. What if the old body was wrong? What if this animal was not an elongated pursuit form at all? What if it was shorter, deeper, and heavier? Less a sleek missile than a wall of muscle and armor built around a skull that did most of the work. The revised estimates were startling. A typical adult Dunkleosteus torelli, represented by specimen CMNH5768, came out around 3.4 to 3.5 meters. The largest known individuals may be 3.9 to 4.1. Lengths over 5 meters under that model become highly unlikely. One of the most iconic giant killers in paleoart may have lost half its body length in a single paper. It did not become less frightening. It became stranger. Picture that late Devonian basin, about 360 million years ago. Dim water, mud below, fine sediment hanging in the dark like smoke. Out of it comes a head first, not because that is how the animal hunted, but because that is the part history allowed to survive. Armor-plated face, neck shield, jaws that snap shut with forces measured in thousands of newtons. If the newer reconstruction is right, then the classic image of a long, shark-bodied hunter misses the point. Dunkleosteus may have been a swimming head, a compact predator with its mass and mechanics concentrated forward, where the kill happened. The bite force numbers suddenly read differently. The 2007 biomechanics study modeled that tremendous bite on a large 6-meter individual. The skull mechanics were real. The leverage was real. The violence in the jaws was real. But if Torelli was usually closer to 3.5 or 4.1 meters than 6, then the image fixed in documentaries for years. Giant body, giant bite, giant shark-like proportions, starts to break apart. Not because Dunkleosteus was weak, because we may have attached the right jaws to the wrong animal. The fossils keep pushing us toward that mistake because they preserve the dramatic part, the face, the blades, the armor. They look like certainty. The rest of the body refuses to give it. There is another artifact in the file. A Cleveland Museum specimen, CMNH5302, has gouges and breakage consistent with bites from another large arthrodire, likely Dunkleosteus. At first glance, it sounds clean. Cannibalism, one armored predator attacking another. The marks do not speak that clearly. They could mean predation, or aggression, or scavenging. Post-mortem breakage shaped by a very convenient jaw. Even here, the moment itself is gone. So what do we actually know? We know J. Terrell found the first known fossils in 1867. We know the Cleveland Shale preserved armored heads because low-oxygen mud protected what decay usually destroys. We know Dunkleosteus was a placoderm, not a shark, and that its teeth were self-sharpening bony plates. We know Ohio made Dunkleosteus torelli its official state fossil fish in 2020, which is a very Ohio way of saying your local monster matters. And we know the animal's most famous image may have been built on a rear half that almost never fossilizes. That missing half changes the predator itself. A 10-meter leviathan hunts one way. A 3.5-meter deep-bodied crusher hunts another.
One is a familiar apex hunter, scaled to absurd size. The other is harder to sort, more compact, more specialized, more alien. The body shrinks, and the animal gets less cinematic, but more real. The evidence arrives in pieces. The missing piece controls the whole picture. Dunkleosteus was not a giant shark with armor. It was a skull the sea refused to finish. Number 6. Kronosaurus. You're in outback Queensland in 1931. Heat, flies, white limestone baking under the sun. A rancher named R.W.H. Thomas points at bones sticking out of rock at Army Downs, and Harvard graduate student William E. Shevel sees something enormous. Not a loose tooth, not a rib, a marine reptile trapped in stone hundreds of miles from the sea. It sounds impossible until you remember what this land used to be. In the early Cretaceous, the Eromanga Sea covered inland Australia. Where cattle stood in 1931, saltwater once moved over plains full of turtles, sharks, fish, ammonites, squid-like animals, and long-necked plesiosaurs. Shevel was not finding a monster in a desert. He was finding the broken remains of the animal that had ruled that vanished sea. But the story started earlier. In 1899, a piece of jaw with 6 teeth was sent from the Hughenden area of north-central Queensland to the Queensland Museum. That was all, a small, hard clue from a dead ocean. For years, the fragment sat there, important but incomplete, as if the deep had given up one corner of a face and kept the rest. Then, in 1924, Queensland Museum paleontologist Heber Longman studied it and made the call. Giant short-necked pliosaur, new species, Kronosaurus queenslandicus. Now there was a name. There still was not a body. That is how extinct predators often arrive. The name appears first, the body takes decades. In the gap, the myth gets there before the skeleton. Shevel's Army Downs fossil looked like the answer. Workers dynamited the blocks out of the limestone, packed them in crates, padded them with wool, and shipped them to Cambridge, Massachusetts.
More than 4 tons of fossil-bearing rock crossed half the planet because somebody in Queensland had noticed bones in a paddock. The sea gave up a jaw in 1899, then a field site in 1931. After that, humans had to force the rest out with drills, plaster, money, and guesswork. And guesswork is exactly what came next. Years later, with funding from Godfrey Cabot, Harvard mounted the giant skeleton. It was spectacular. 42 feet long, about 12.8 meters. A broad skull, short neck, 4 huge flippers. The kind of animal that turns a museum hall into a hunting ground. Visitors looked up and saw an apex predator from Australia's inland sea. A reptile so oversized it felt almost unfair. There was one problem. Roughly 1/3 of that famous mount is plaster. Paleontologists gave it a brutal nickname, Plasterosaurus. Not because the fossil was fake. It was real, very real. But too much of the animal had to be restored, extended, and inferred. Missing vertebrae were replaced. Gaps were filled. The body grew. Once a giant predator is mounted in public, that mounted version is the one people remember. For years, Kronosaurus existed in 2 forms. In the rock, it was incomplete. In the museum, it was huge. And huge changes the animal in your head. At 13 meters, or close to Harvard's 12.8, you picture a near-mythic superpredator. At about 10 meters, which later researchers think is more likely, it is still enormous. Still among the largest known pliosaurs. Still a top predator of the lower Cretaceous seas. But it becomes a different kind of animal. More compact, more believable, less like legend, more like something built for one job. Start with the head. Skull was at least 2.4 meters long, nearly 8 feet of bone and bite. Not a narrow snout for grabbing fish. A heavy-built skull for seizing and crushing large prey. Sea turtles show up in the file. Elasmosaurids too, those long-necked plesiosaurs moving through the same sea. There are shark remains, fish, cephalopods, even evidence that may point to bites on its own kind. Stomach contents, punctures, crushing marks. This is forensic work. Damage patterns, hard traces, meals that stayed on the inside too long. Now place it under the surface of the Eromanga Sea. Light above, silt below. Something with a skull the size of a man closes in from the side. Not fast in the cinematic way. Heavy, direct. Built to take a turtle shell, a plesiosaur flipper, or a chunk out of anything that shared its water. But the ground shifts again. The most famous Kronosaurus in the world may not be Kronosaurus queenslandicus in the cleanest sense at all. The name-bearing specimen, the actual anchor for the species, is still that fragmentary Queensland jaw from 1899. 6 teeth, part of a jaw. That is the legal core of the name. The Harvard skeleton came later. It is far more complete, far more famous, and far more altered by restoration. The public animal and the official animal may not be the same thing. In 2021 and 2022, a taxonomic revision proposed that the Harvard material should be moved into a new genus, Eectus longmani. Not Kronosaurus, something else. That sounds technical, but it changes the monster in the room. Revision holds, then the giant reptile most people picture when they hear Kronosaurus belongs under a different name, while Kronosaurus queenslandicus remains tied to a frustratingly incomplete fossil from Queensland. The icon splits in two. One animal in the museum, another in the rules. It is a perfect extinct predator problem. You do not lose the beast because it was weak, or rare, or unimportant. You lose it because the evidence came up broken, the reconstruction became famous, and the name attached itself to the wrong silhouette. So what are you looking at under Harvard's mount? A top predator from a vanished inland sea, yes. A pliosaur with a skull at least 2.4 meters long, probably no more than about 10 meters from nose to tail, built to feed on turtles, plesiosaurs, sharks, fish, and almost anything else it could catch. But maybe not the animal the label says, maybe not even the same genus. For all its size, Kronosaurus does not come down to one giant skeleton. It comes down to a 1899 jaw fragment, a 1931 chance encounter in Queensland, more than 4 tons of blasted limestone, and a museum mount patched into certainty by plaster. Plasterosaurus. Number 5. Tylosaurus. On June 5, 1918, Charles H. Sternberg signed a fossil hunting contract with the University of Kansas and led his sons George and Levi into the Smoky Hill Chalk near Twin Butte Creek, Logan County. The paper was dry, simple, practical. Collect, crate, ship. Out on the Kansas plains, nothing about it looked like the floor of an ancient sea. White chalk bluffs, wind through short grass, heat rising off the ground. But Sternberg had spent enough years in these beds to know what the surface hides. One bone weathering out can mean a whole carcass still locked inside. One curve in the chalk can become a skull 3 feet long. So he and the boys moved slowly along the slope, eyes down, watching for color changes no one else would notice. By then the place already had a history. In 1911, C.D. Bunker and his crew had pulled a giant mosasaur out of Logan County, a specimen later mounted at 45 feet in Lawrence. But a mounted giant is one thing. Out here, before plaster and steel, before museum light, all you get is a stain in rock and the chance that it keeps going. George saw it first, or said later that he did, a row of dark points entering and vanishing from the chalk like nails driven into a wall. Charles knelt beside them and brushed the surface with his fingers. Teeth. Long, conical, slightly recurved. Not a fish, not one of the toothed birds they sometimes found. Mosasaur. He widened the patch with a knife and handpick, lifting chalk in thin flakes. More teeth appeared. Then jaw. The curve of the snout, narrow and drawn out ahead of the tooth row, in that blunt, bony extension Cope had tied to the animal back in 1869, after fossil material from western Kansas had reached Louis Agassiz at Harvard the year before. Tylosaurus, the knob lizard of the western interior seaway. The contract told them to collect, so they worked the way fossil men worked in 1918. They cut a trench around the exposed bone. They left columns of chalk to support the block. They laid damp paper over the surface, then strips of burlap soaked in plaster. White over white. When the jacket set, they undercut it with chisels, rolled the block, and built a second shell on the underside. Every move had to be clean. One wrong crack, and the specimen would split across whatever the sea had saved. It kept growing as they followed it, vertebra after vertebra, ribs arcing outward, paddle bones tucked where they belonged. This was no fragment. It was most of an animal, laid out in the chalk as if it had settled onto a seafloor 80 million years earlier and been covered before scavengers could tear it apart. Charles measured what he could in the trench and knew they had an adult, around 8.8 meters long. Big enough to make the chalk face feel suddenly small. Then the jacket came off. Now the work happens in the quarry shed, or maybe in the museum prep room after the crates arrive. The air tastes of chalk dust. A needle scratches. A small hammer taps through matrix that has not seen light since the late Cretaceous. Rib after rib emerges, pale against the gray-white stone. Then something is wrong. Inside the body cavity, beneath the ribs where the organs once sat, there are more bones, smaller ones, slender, too delicate for mosasaur ribs, too well placed to be random wash-in. George clears a little more, a long shaft. Then another, then the shape of a paddle element, not the hunter's. Charles had seen enough mixed skeletons to be careful. Bones wash together, carcasses drift. A rib from one animal ends up under the tail of another, and some excited collector invents a story. But these bones were not lying beside the Tylosaurus. They were inside it, protected by the rib cage, clustered where the stomach had been. Their surfaces told the same story. They were etched. The outer texture had been bitten by acid, not smashed, not weathered, digested. The specimen stopped being just a skeleton. For roughly 25 million years, plesiosaurs and mosasaurs shared the same seas. Their skeletons had been found in the same formations, sometimes not far apart. That showed they lived together. It did not show what happened when they met. This block did.
Inside this Tylosaurus were the partial remains of a plesiosaur, swallowed, processed, and never finished. A long-necked marine reptile inside a larger marine reptile. Predator and prey locked together not in combat, not in a painting, but in the chemistry of a gut. You can build the last minutes from what the block preserves. The water above was warm and shallow by ocean standards, part of the inland sea that once split North America in two. Tylosaurus comes in from below or behind, all muscle and tail thrust, jaws lined with teeth built to seize, not slice. The plesiosaur twists. It may be young, it may already be injured. It does not matter for long.
Mosasaur catches flesh or flipper, shakes once, and the body loses shape. Chunks go down first. Maybe the whole carcass follows in pieces. Then the hunter swims off with a stomach full of reptile and dies before digestion finishes the job. Out in the chalk quarry, Sternberg could not see all of that at once. He had fragments of a sequence, because that is how the deep returns its evidence. One rib cage, one cluster of etched bones, one death sealed before the meal was done. Even the hunter's outline would not stay fixed forever. More than a century later, on May 21, 2026, some of the biggest museum animals long called Tylosaurus proriger began to shift under their labels. The giant Logan County specimen people knew as Bunker, the 45-foot celebrity in Kansas, was pulled toward a new name from older material centered in North Texas, Tylosaurus rex, a species based on fossils about 80 million years old and stretching from 25 to 43 feet.
So if you stand in the prep room with Sternberg's 1918 Predator in front of you, the animal seems stable. Kansas chalk. Tylosaurus proriger. Adult hunter with a plesiosaur in its stomach. But names move. Sizes move with them. The silhouette in the museum is not always the one in the paper. Charles keeps clearing matrix from the ribs. More plesiosaur bone appears where no one would want to find it if they hoped for a simple skeleton. A vertebra, part of a limb, enough to know what happened, not enough to show every step. The chalk gives him the kill, but only in pieces. Dust falls from the gut of the mosasaur. Inside the predator, another animal is still there. Number 4. Mosasaurus hoffmanni. In the early 1770s, Johann Leonard Hoffmann went down into the chalk tunnels of Mount St. Peter, just south of Maastricht. He was following rumors of a monster buried in white stone. Hoffmann was an army surgeon by trade, but like many 18th century men with sharp eyes and risky hobbies, he collected fossils on the side. Quarry workers had cut into something enormous in the galleries under the hill. A jaw, then more bone, then a skull too big to belong to any fish they knew. Hoffmann paid the miners, took the specimen, and brought the great animal of Maastricht into his own collection. That first encounter must have been unnerving. There was no full skeleton, no neat museum mount, just a head emerging from chalk that had once been seafloor, with teeth set in a long, deep jaw. Later work would show 14 tooth positions in the dentary of the Paris holotype, each carrying large, faceted, finely serrated teeth. These were not spikes for grabbing. They were blades for holding and cutting. This was not another curiosity pried from a quarry wall. It was the front end of an apex predator. The skull did not stay with Hoffmann for long. The land above those tunnels belonged to a local canon, Theodorus Johannes Göding, and in court he won possession of the fossil. The prize left the collector who rescued it,
and ended up in a house inside the fortress of Maastricht. That reversal matters. The specimen's story was never only about anatomy. From the start, it moved through ownership disputes, status, and war. The bones had survived the end of the Cretaceous. Then they had to survive people. In 1794, French revolutionary troops besieged Maastricht. Cannon fire struck the fortress, streets turned to rubble. Inside that city sat one famous skull, already whispered about as a natural marvel. When the French took Maastricht, the fossil was seized with the rest of the spoils and shipped to Paris. In 1795, it entered the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, where it still carries a catalogue number almost absurdly clinical for something with such a violent history. MNHNAC 9648. Officially, a specimen moved from one collection to another. Follow Hoffmann from the quarry to the courtroom to the siege, and the story looks much rougher. A surgeon heard about a buried beast, bought it out of the chalk, lost it to a landowner, and watched it disappear into the machinery of empire. The animal crossed from a dark tunnel to one of the most important scientific institutions in Europe because a city fell. The sea had given up a piece of evidence. War broke it free. By 1808, the skull had reached the desk of Georges Cuvier. Here, Hoffmann's fossil stopped being a local monster and became something much larger. Cuvier studied the Paris specimen and argued that it was not a whale, not a crocodile. It was a giant marine lizard from a world no longer here. That lands differently now. We live after dinosaurs, after extinction charts, after museum halls full of vanished animals. In 1808, this was still explosive. Naturalists argued over whether species could truly disappear at all. Many still leaned toward a stable world, where strange fossils must belong to animals still living somewhere, perhaps in some unexplored ocean. Hoffmann's skull helped break that idea apart. Long before paleontology settled into a modern science, this animal became one of the pieces that made extinction scientifically credible. That is, the scale of the find. Mosasaurus hoffmannii was deadly in life, but its first known skull was just as disruptive in death. It struck at an idea. It pushed European science to admit that entire forms of life could rule the sea, vanish completely, and leave only fragments behind. Fragments are exactly what this animal keeps giving us. In life, Mosasaurus hoffmannii hunted in the warm seas of the late Cretaceous, in the island world that covered much of northern Europe between about 166 million years ago. Its famous material belongs to the Upper Maastrichtian, very near the end. Picture shallow chalk seas over what is now the Netherlands and Belgium, bright water over white sediment, a predator moving through it with a skull built for seizure and control. Modern work, including 223 tooth enamel isotope measurements in a 2025 study of mosasaur foraging, places large mosasaurines like Mosasaurus among broad-ranging apex predators. They were not coast-hugging scavengers. They were not narrow specialists. They covered water, fed across habitats, and sat near the top. That fits the head Hoffmann first heard about in the tunnels. The teeth were not delicate. The jaws were not experimental. Everything about the skull points to leverage, grip, and repeated violence. But the old problem returns here. We know this creature partly through spectacular skulls, jaws, and isolated bones, not through a perfect, parade-ready skeleton. So even now, one basic question still wobbles. How large did the biggest individuals really get? Estimates rise and shrink with the scaling method, because the body behind the head is still missing in the most literal sense. That missing body runs underneath this whole story. Hoffmann found a skull, not a complete answer. Cuvier had enough to help prove extinction, but not enough to end the arguments. Even the name would not hold still. The genus name Mosasaurus appeared in 1822. The species honoring Hoffmann followed in 1829. Even now, specialists still debate whether the historically correct spelling should be Hoffmanni, while the popular one remains Hoffmannii. The animal is famous. The label is unstable. The head is real. The full silhouette keeps slipping. Stand in Paris in front of MNHNAC 9648, and the story can look settled. A great fossil from Maastricht. A giant marine lizard. A textbook emblem of extinction. Clean case. Clean label. Clean lineage from quarry to science. That is the official version. The real one is rougher. This animal entered history the way it entered the rock record. Torn loose, fought over,
carried away by force, and understood from a skull far more complete than the truth around it. Officially, it is a specimen. On the ground, it was a stolen head from a lost sea. The body that could have fixed its true size never came with it.
Number 3. Basilosaurus. In 1834, the English anatomist Richard Harlan studied giant vertebrae from the American South and gave them a name fit for a sea monster, Basilosaurus, king lizard. The bones were massive. Some vertebrae measured over a foot long. The body looked serpentine. Alabama later made Basilosaurus cetoides its official state fossil, which shows how completely that image took hold. A reptile emperor of the ancient sea. The name was wrong almost immediately. Richard Owen examined the teeth and skull and saw what Harlan had missed. This was not a lizard, it was a whale. An early whale, yes, but still a whale. Air-breathing, warm-blooded, fully marine, and already built for violence. The sea serpent myth lasted because the body looked the part. The teeth told a different story. Start with the mechanics. The Egyptian species Basilosaurus isis reached 15 meters, sometimes 18, about the length of a modern bus and a half, but stretched thinner, longer, stranger. The skull was narrow, the snout projected forward like forceps. The teeth were not made for filtering, nibbling, or any of the gentle jobs people casually attach to the word whale. They were made to seize, slice, and break down flesh. It was not one killing tool. It was a sequence. Front teeth grabbed, cheek teeth sheared, pressure cracked. Now move to Egypt. Here the argument stops being about anatomy and starts looking like a crime scene. About 38 to 36.5 million years ago, the place now called Wadi al-Hitan lay under a warm, shallow sea in what is now Fayum province. Early whales bred there. Smaller whales, especially Dorodon atrox, used those waters as a nursery. Adults were about 5 meters long. Their calves were much smaller. So the basin held young whales, and moving through it was a predator roughly 3 times longer than an adult Dorodon. That suggests a hierarchy. But suggestion is not enough. The deep returns evidence in broken pieces. What matters are marks, positions, and force. In 2012, Julia Falke examined juvenile Dorodon skulls from Wadi al-Hitan like fitted evidence, not display fossils. The skulls carried bite marks, not vague damage, specific punctures and crushing traces. She digitally placed those smaller skulls inside the jaws of an adult Basilosaurus isis specimen and checked the spacing. The fit worked. Tooth against wound, pattern against pattern. The damage matched the predator's mouth. That matters because bite marks alone can stay ambiguous. Bones get trampled, sediment shifts, scavengers reuse carcasses. But when wound spacing lines up with the teeth of one candidate, the list gets short fast. Then came the second piece. In 2019, Manya Voss, Philip Gingerich, Mohammed Sameh Antar, and Iyad Zalmout described a Basilosaurus isis skeleton from Wadi al-Hitan associated with prey remains concentrated where the stomach would have been. The specimen is known as WH10001. That detail changes the whole animal. Not because fossil stomach contents are dramatic by themselves, but because placement matters. Random bones near a skeleton can mean almost anything. Bones clustered in the abdominal region mean digestion left a map. The map pointed to whale-on-whale predation. You can picture the attack. Chest-deep Eocene water, warm and silty, visibility gone after a few meters. By Dorodon calves surface to breathe. Then, a longer shadow cuts across them. Basilosaurus does not need the blunt force head of a macro-predatory shark. It has reach. It has teeth built for grip and shearing. It closes in, catches a juvenile, and the struggle turns mechanical. Hold, twist, slice. Bite force estimates published in 2015 reached at least 16,400 newtons at the upper third premolar. Under a shearing scenario, the reaction forces could exceed 20,000. Those numbers are not decoration. They explain the wounds. Not just punctures, not random breakage. Controlled damage from an animal built to process large, struggling prey. Here the old myth finally collapses. Early whales are often imagined as awkward transition forms, half-finished experiments waiting for the real predators to appear. Basilosaurus was nothing like that. It was not a primitive, gentle whale. Dolphins were far in the future. Sperm whales were far in the future. Orcas did not exist yet. But in late Eocene Egypt, A whale had already taken a role that feels disturbingly modern. Apex hunter in coastal water, targeting other marine mammals. Even the famous little hind limbs fit the evidence better than the myth. In 1990, Egyptian Basilosaurus isis fossils produced the first known functional pelvic limb and foot bones in whales. At first glance, that sounds like a throwback to land, a reptilian leftover. Another point for the giant sea serpent fantasy. But the limbs were tiny, detached from the backbone, and useless for walking. They were too reduced for propulsion. Researchers think they may have helped during mating. The legs were real, just not in the way the myth wanted. Body plan is deceptive. Long torso, eel-like profile, small hind limbs. The silhouette pushes the eye toward the wrong answer. Predators are not identified by silhouette. They are identified by contact damage, by where the prey turns up, by the force the jaws can deliver. One caution remains. Were all those juvenile Dorodon killed outright by Basilosaurus? Or did it sometimes scavenge carcasses in the nursery too? That part is still partly inferential. The bite marks fit. The stomach region remains fit. The ecological picture fits. But the exact kill sequence is reconstructed from aftermath, not witnessed behavior. No paleontologist gets a clean confession. It does not need one. A 15 to 18 meter whale with slicing teeth. Juvenile whale skulls bearing matching bite marks. Prey remains concentrated in the abdominal region of a Basilosaurus skeleton. Bite force estimates high enough to make those wounds plausible. Put it together, and the scene stops being easy to soften. This was not a drifter picking at occasional carrion. It was a marine predator working a calving ground. So the ancient whale nursery changes shape. No open blue calm. No half-evolved gentle giant. Just shallow water, young whales surfacing, a long head moving beneath them. Then one calf is gone, and the water goes flat again. Broken skulls on the bottom. That is what the deep gave back. Number 2. Leviathan melvilli. In November 2008, on the last day of a field trip in the Pisco Ica Desert of southern Peru, Klaus Post stopped at Cerro Colorado and looked at a whale skull that did not make sense. It was large, about 3 meters long, about 190 centimeters across at the skull. But size was not the issue. The teeth were. This was supposed to be the remains of a harmless baleen whale from the lower Pisco Formation, around 12 to 13 million years old. Baleen whales do not carry huge functional teeth in both jaws. This skull did. Start with the sockets. 11 deep sockets in the lower jaw on each side. 9 in the upper jaw on each side. Modern sperm whales still have teeth below, but the upper set is reduced and functionally absent. This animal had the full equipment, upper and lower. The teeth met. They held. They drove force into flesh. Then the teeth themselves. More than 36 centimeters long, about 12 centimeters at maximum diameter. Among the largest functional biting teeth known in any animal. Not display structures, not tusks, not loose ornaments of bone. Feeding tools. They sat in a jaw with room for enormous muscles, attached to a short, broad snout built for force at the front end, where prey fights back hardest. The name sperm whale sends you in the wrong direction. Today's sperm whale is a deep diver. It chases squid in black water. It uses suction. Its head is built around sound production and buoyancy control for long descents. This animal worked a different part of the ocean, closer to the surface, in brighter water, against large vertebrate prey. Less like a giant squid specialist. Like an oversized killer whale, scaled to impossible dimensions. In 2010, Olivier Lambert and colleagues described the specimen, catalogued as MUSM 1676, from a site about 35 kilometers south-southwest of Ica. The skull was roughly 75% complete, with mandible fragments and associated teeth. That matters because most extinct ocean predators reach us as scraps, a few teeth, a broken vertebra, a jaw piece with too much missing to settle the argument. This one came in with enough of the head preserved to lock down the mechanics, and when the head is 3 meters long, the mechanics tell you the life. Estimated body length came out between 13.5 and 17.5 meters, roughly the length of a large male modern sperm whale. But length alone tells you little. A bus and a crocodile can share a measurement and not an ecology. So go back to the business end. Short, wide snout. Massive temporal spaces for jaw muscles.
teeth in both jaws. Big prey specialist.
You do not build that arrangement for sucking in soft cephalopods at depth. You build it to seize something muscular, slippery, and large enough to hit back. Now put it back into its sea. The late Middle Miocene coast of Peru was not empty water with one apex predator moving through it. Cerro Colorado preserves an assemblage that reads like an inventory from a dismantled marine ecosystem. Sharks, bony fish, marine turtles, crocodiles, seabirds, baleen whales, toothed whales, seals, even marine sloths. The skull was not found in isolation. It turned up in a place already crowded with prey, competitors, scavengers, and bystanders. A feeding ground, a graveyard, a record built from collisions. The group in that list matters most here. Baleen whales. During the Miocene, they were diversifying. More forms, more bodies in the water column, more medium-sized whales available to hunt. For an odontocete with a 3-meter skull and biting teeth the size of short swords, the menu becomes obvious. This was a whale that ate whales. The anatomy points there again and again. The upper teeth are functional because prey had to be trapped, not inhaled. The lower sockets are deep because force had to run through the whole jaw. The snout is broad because bending stress matters when a struggling animal twists. The body reaches 13.5 to 17.5 meters because mass helps when the target is another cetacean. The measurements do not drift toward the deep-diving sperm whale of today. They converge on a macropredator built around whale flesh. Another hunter was in those waters too, Megalodon. We already met the teeth. Here, the overlap is the point. Same broad interval of the Miocene, same coastline.
Same class of prey. Off Peru, two separate lineages may have arrived at the same answer: get very large, reinforce the bite, and target whales. One was a shark with serrated blades. The other was a toothed whale with conical teeth over 36 centimeters long. Same resource, different machinery. That does not mean they fought on sight. Fossils rarely grant that kind of scene. But the ancient Pacific off Peru was rich enough to feed both. Medium-sized whales were not incidental. They were infrastructure. Energy moving upward into bodies large enough to sustain more than one giant predator. The picture is not a lone monster in open water. It is a food web dense enough to carry multiple giants at once.
There's even a smaller complication buried in the paperwork. The animal first appeared under the name Leviathan melvilli. Good name, memorable, impossible to keep. Leviathan had already been used in 1841 for a mastodon synonym, so the whale had to be renamed Leviathan melvilli. Taxonomy sounds tidy from a distance. In practice, it works like salvage. Names are recovered, checked, and sometimes stripped away. The bones stay. The label changes. The bones are why this case holds. Isolated giant teeth from Australia, South Africa, Argentina, Chile, and California have been used to suggest that Leviathan, or something extremely close to it, may have been widespread. But a giant tooth alone is not a confession. Big macroraptorial sperm whales can resemble one another when preservation is poor. A crown survives. The skull does not. The shape hints. Certainty drains out. So the Peruvian skull becomes the anchor. MUSM 1676, roughly 75% complete. One locality, one head. Enough architecture preserved to say what this animal did. But that certainty stops at the edge of the specimen. Beyond Peru, the trail breaks into scattered teeth and disputed assignments. The predator is real. Its wider empire is not. A 3-meter skull. Teeth over 36 centimeters long. 2 working jaws. A 13.5 to 17.5 meter body built to grab other whales near the surface, while Megalodon cruised the same sea. It sounds settled. It is not. The most famous giant killer whale of the Miocene rests on one decisive skull and a haze of uncertain teeth. The deep gave us the head. It kept the range. Broken pieces. Number 1. Otodus megalodon. What if the largest predatory shark in history did not begin in the abyss, or even in open ocean, but in water shallow enough to protect its young? The consequences are immediate. You are not looking at a beast that only needed whales and space. You are looking at an animal tied to specific coastlines, warm shallows, stable prey, and room for newborns to survive their first years. Break that chain, and even a 50-ton predator can disappear. In the late Miocene, about 10 million years ago, the Gatun Sea of Panama looked nothing like the stage Megalodon usually gets. Not a storm-black trench,
not a lone giant cutting through blue water. Catalina Pimiento, Dana Arrett, Bruce McFadden, and Gordon Hubble went into the Gatun Formation at Las Lomas and Isla Payardi and did something more damaging to the myth than finding one huge tooth. They measured many smaller ones. It sounds minor until the numbers land. The classic adult megalodon may have reached 15 to 20 meters, with the largest estimates pushing around 60 feet and perhaps up to 50 tons. But many of the Gatun teeth did not belong to adults. Their owners were estimated at roughly 2 to 10.5 meters long. Not the apex giant in full form. Newborns. Juveniles. A nursery. Change the picture. You are standing in coastal Panama 10 million years ago. The water is warm. Visibility is poor. The bottom drops gently, not suddenly. Small whales move through productive shallows. Fish are everywhere. Somewhere out there is a young megalodon, already longer than a modern great white in some cases, using the coast the way later sharks would use protected bays. Nursery grounds are not optional scenery. Our infrastructure. Adults can roam from Denmark to New Zealand, across most non-polar oceans. Reproduction gets tied to place. Adults did roam. Fossils put Otodus megalodon across an enormous range, almost a global circuit outside the poles. It carried serrated teeth built to slice flesh rather than just seize it. Whatever exact body shape it had, it was built for distance and force. The familiar reconstruction gives it the thick, brutal silhouette of an oversized great white. But even that image has started to wobble. A 2024 study argued that the standard great white template may be too confident, that Megalodon could have been longer and slimmer than the public versions stamped onto posters and documentaries for decades. Even here, with the biggest name in the water, the deep does the same thing it has done all video long. It returns the teeth. It withholds the body. The feeding traces are harder to dismiss. In Aurora, North Carolina, at the Nutrien Aurora Phosphate Mine, a neogene sperm whale tooth turned up carrying 3 gouges, not scratches, gouges. One of them preserved raking bite traces that fit a megatooth shark. Start there, not with the cartoon breach. A whale tooth, already massive, scored by another predator's mouth. 3 marks, 1 bite path. One moment where 2 giants met close enough for enamel to record it. We do not get the whole attack. We almost never do. We get impact damage. We get the aftermath. Broken pieces again. But it is enough to place Megalodon against large marine mammals in direct, violent contact. By the early Pliocene, the sea held at least 3 pressures at once. Whales were changing. Climate was cooling. Great whites were no longer background sharks. Zinc isotope work published in 2022 found overlapping trophic levels between early Pliocene great whites and Megalodon, which is a technical way of saying they may have been eating from the same table. That does not mean a 5-meter great white was physically overpowering a giant adult Megalodon. It means something more dangerous to a species over time. Competition does not have to beat the king in a duel. It only has to keep taking the food, season after season, generation after generation, especially while nursery habitat is narrowing and prey communities are shifting. The extinction story stops looking clean. It looks like a trap closing from several sides. Adult Megalodon needed large prey. Young Megalodon needed warm coastal nurseries. Cooling seas could hit migration routes and prey structure. Ecological change in shallow water could hit reproduction before it hit adult hunting. Early great whites may have been targeting similar prey at smaller sizes with lower food demands. The pressure would not arrive as one dramatic blow. It would arrive as attrition. The dates reflect that uncertainty. In 2014, quantitative work placed the modal extinction around 2.6 million years ago. In 2019, a critique of younger records argued the likely disappearance came earlier, closer to 3.6 million years ago. A million years is a huge gap when you are trying to assign blame. Did climate and habitat fragmentation do most of the killing? Did competition sharpen the decline? Did the nursery system fail first, long before the last giant adults vanished from open water? We do not have the final carcass. We have distribution, teeth, isotopes, marks, pieces. Pieces can still redraw the animal. Once Panama enters the story, Megalodon is no longer just a giant mouth in the pelagic dark. It becomes a life cycle. Birth in the shallows, growth in protected, productive water, expansion into an ocean-spanning predator, collision with whales, then a long squeeze as the seas cool and the food web rearranges itself. That is a different kind of terror. Not a monster too big to fail, but a hunter so specialized
and so dependent on hidden coastal starting points that the biggest predator in the ocean may have been most vulnerable at the beginning of its life. That possibility changes the opening assumption. If Megalodon really needed nursery grounds like Gatun, then its extinction may have begun far from the offshore hunting grounds people imagine. Not with the death of the last adult, with the failure of the next generation. By the time the chapter closes in the Pliocene, the animal that may have structured whale fear across entire oceans is gone. No complete skeleton, no preserved strike in motion. Mostly teeth, spread from one coast to another like evidence shaken loose from the same locked room. The adults vanish, the nurseries vanish, the body itself stays debated. Megalodon became extinct at the end of the Pliocene.